Most people know the headline version. World War II starts with hatred, with extremism, with men who turn ideology into destruction. Books make it digestible. Clear villains, clear heroes. A world rescued at the last moment. But that story skips the infrastructure because wars don't run on anger. They run on money, on industrial capacity, on agreements made quietly while attention is elsewhere. If you follow that trail honestly, it doesn't lead first to battlefields. It leads to banks, to boardrooms, to deals approved years before the first shot was fired. This isn't only about Nazis. It's about who made their rise operational, who financed expansion, who kept resources flowing while the public remained unaware. Because once you see where the war was actually constructed, the absence of this lesson becomes obvious, and the question stops being who started the war, and becomes who made it possible. Germany didn't emerge from World War I defeated. It emerged hollow. Its factories stood still. Its currency collapsed so completely that savings vanished overnight. Wages became meaningless. A lifetime of work could be erased between breakfast and dinner. Unemployment surged. Hungersnot. The state owed more than it could ever repay, locked into reparations that drained what little economic life remained. This wasn't a nation preparing for conquest. It was a nation barely functioning. And that detail matters. Because armies don't rise from desperation alone. You can't build tanks with ideology. You can't fuel planes with nationalism. You can't move an army on promises. Modern war requires inputs: steel, oil, machinery, and above all, capital. Germany had none of it, which forces a question history rarely asks. So where did the money come from? The answer sits an ocean away. While Germany was collapsing, another place was overflowing. New York. Wall Street in the 1,920 seconds wasn't cautious or moral, it was liquid. American banks were swimming in cash, fresh off wartime profits and industrial expansion, hunting for yield anywhere it could be found. And broken nations are perfect investments. To bankers, Germany wasn't a warning, it was a balance sheet. A country with skilled labor, advanced industry, and no leverage of its own. Desperate borrowers don't negotiate, they accept terms. This wasn't sympathy, it was arithmetic. Money doesn't ask who you are. It asks what you're worth, and how long before it multiplies. When nations break, financiers take notes. The solution was framed as rescue, recovery, stability. It was called the Dawes Plan, and on paper it looked like help. American banks would loan Germany the money it needed to stabilize its currency, restart industry, and meet its obligations. The headlines said reconstruction, the speeches said peace, but the structure told a different story. These weren't gifts, they were loans with interest, with oversight, with conditions that quietly handed control to foreign creditors. German railways, taxes, and industrial revenues were effectively pledged to repay American lenders. Money flowed in, but ownership flowed out. Germany didn't escape its collapse. It was reorganized inside someone else's ledger. Debt replaced occupation, contracts replaced armies, and dependence replaced defeat. Aid that never intended to leave. When Hitler took power in 1933, he didn't inherit an empty vault. He inherited a system. A financial pipeline already built, already flowing, already tied to foreign capital. The factories were idle, but the framework to restart them was in place. The loans existed. The relationships existed. The dependency was already locked in. This is the part that gets misunderstood. Hitler didn't convince Wall Street to fund him. He stepped into an economy that had been engineered to rely on outside money long before he arrived. And the moment he took control, that money didn't flee. It stayed, because nothing about the arrangement had changed. Contracts were still honored, payments still moved, returns were still expected. The ideology shifted, but the incentives didn't. The system didn't change hands, it stayed running. And that brings us to the real weapon of modern war. Not rifles, not flags, oil. Every army in the 20th century runs on fuel. Trucks, tanks, planes, ships, all of it is useless without energy moving through the system. No fuel means no mobility means no conquest. Germany had a problem no speech could solve. It had no oil fields, no colonies, no access to Middle Eastern reserves. It was surrounded, constrained, and dependent. An army without fuel doesn't advance, it stalls, it collapses. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because if Germany couldn't access oil naturally, then someone had to show them how to manufacture it. Wars don't run on speeches. The answer came from technology, not geography. American oil companies had already solved a problem Germany couldn't. They knew how to turn coal into fuel, a process called hydrogenation. Complex, expensive, and extremely valuable. With it, a country without oil could still power an army. That knowledge didn't stay in textbooks. It was licensed, shared, Partnered. Through joint ventures and technical agreements, American oil expertise flowed into Germany. Plants were built, processes refined. Synthetic fuel began moving into tanks, planes, and trucks. Quietly, efficiently, legally. This wasn't ignorance. It wasn't an accident. Reports were sent. Executives knew where the technology was going and why it mattered. And the flow didn't stop when the war began. It didn't stop when borders fell. It didn't stop when Europe burned. Without this fuel, the Blitzkrieg doesn't roll. The Luftwaffe doesn't fly. The war machine stalls within months. Without this, the war ends before it begins. Fuel made movement possible. Data made it efficient. As the war expanded, killing stopped being chaotic. It became organized, scheduled, counted, tracked. Violence at this scale can't rely on memory or paper lists. It needs systems, records, standardization. Modern mass violence isn't driven by rage. It's driven by logistics. Trains had to arrive on time. Labor had to be allocated. Bodies had to be counted. Supplies had to be measured. Decisions about who worked, who moved, and who disappeared were turned into rows, codes, and categories. This is how brutality becomes scalable, not through cruelty alone, but through administration, through efficiency that strips away faces and turns people into units. Once killing becomes a process, it no longer feels like murder to the people managing it. It feels like work, like paperwork, like optimization. Genocide doesn't happen by hand anymore. The machines that made this possible didn't look like weapons. They sat in offices, in camps, in administrative buildings, quiet, mechanical, precise. Punch cards, sorting systems, tabulators that could process thousands of entries faster than any human ever could. Each card represented a person, each hole represented a trait, religion, ethnicity, age, ability to work, destination. This wasn't chaos, it was organization. These systems didn't just record what was happening, they shaped it. Transport schedules depended on them, labor assignments depended on them, death counts depended on them, entire camps were run through data, and the machines didn't operate themselves. They were serviced, maintained, updated, leased, royalties were paid, reports were sent back across the Atlantic. No one had to pull the trigger to be responsible. They just had to make the system run smoothly. Efficiency has no conscience. While the killing was being organized, production never slowed. Inside Germany, factories kept running. Assembly lines stayed lit. Machines kept stamping, welding, and turning out parts as the war expanded across Europe. The borders changed. The flags changed. The customers didn't. These weren't makeshift workshops seized by the state. They were modern industrial plants, built for scale, built for speed, built to meet demand. And demand was rising fast. What's striking isn't just that production continued, it's that it continued predictably. Contracts honored, schedules met, output reported. War, for some, was just another operating environment. Neutrality is profitable. Those factories weren't making consumer goods. They were making movement possible. Trucks, engines, transmissions, the unglamorous backbone of war. Armies don't advance on courage, they advance on supply lines. On vehicles that can move men, fuel, ammunition, and food across long distances without stopping. Inside Germany, subsidiaries of major American manufacturers became that backbone. Production ramped up just as invasion plans accelerated. Not after, not in response, in anticipation. These vehicles didn't fight battles, they made battles possible. They carried soldiers into Poland, into France, toward the Soviet Union. Every mile conquered required wheels beneath it. This wasn't symbolic support, it was logistical dominance. Numbers mattered, timing mattered, and the timing was perfect. Wars move on wheels. Money kept moving even after the shooting started. Banks didn't pack up and leave when borders were crossed. Accounts were still managed, assets still protected. Transactions still processed in cities under occupation as long as the door stayed open and the ledgers balanced. To the people being displaced, robbed, and erased, it looked like betrayal. To the institutions involved, it looked like continuity. War was chaos on the ground, but order in the vaults. Branches stayed operational. Decisions were justified as neutrality, as obligation, as procedure. Assets belonging to families who would never return were frozen, transferred, absorbed. Paperwork replaced faces, numbers replaced names. The war redrew maps, but it didn't interrupt finance. Money adapted faster than morality ever could. Money doesn't pick sides. When the war ended, accountability was supposed to begin. It didn't. There were trials, there were headlines, a few executives faced questions, but the system made a different calculation. These companies weren't treated as accomplices. They were treated as assets. The world needed rebuilding. Factories were valuable, expertise was valuable, and soon a new enemy appeared on the horizon. The Cold War rewrote priorities overnight. Justice became inconvenient. Punishment was selective, Settlements were negotiated quietly, files were sealed, relationships were preserved. The same corporations that powered the war were now essential to reconstruction, defense, and growth. So consequences were converted into contracts. Justice stops where utility begins. At this point, it's tempting to treat this as a one-off horror, a historical anomaly, a moment when the world lost its moral footing and then corrected itself. But that explanation doesn't hold, because when you step back, a pattern emerges. The same sequence, repeating whenever power, profit, and crisis collide. First comes collapse, then comes opportunity. Capital steps in, not to prevent disaster, but to position itself inside it. The incentives don't ask who's right, they ask what pays. This isn't about Nazis alone, it's about how money behaves when oversight weakens and urgency takes over, when speed matters more than ethics, when returns matter more than consequences. History doesn't repeat incentives, though. Once you see the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Different countries, different flags, different excuses, the logic stays the same. Global supply chains stretch across borders where labor is cheap and oversight is weak. Authoritarian governments offer stability in exchange for silence. Corporations promise they're just manufacturers, just partners, just following local laws. Responsibility gets diluted across contractors, subsidiaries, and complexity. It sounds modern, it sounds sophisticated, but it's the same equation. Access to massive markets outweighs moral cost, efficiency outweighs human consequence, and distance makes everything easier to ignore. What happened in Germany didn't end with the war. It evolved. It learned new language. It wrapped itself in compliance departments and public relations. Different flags, same logic. At the center of all of this is a misunderstanding people like to hold on to. That corporations are moral actors, that they feel guilt, that they learn lessons. They don't. Corporations respond to incentives, to shareholder expectations, to quarterly earnings and stock prices. Success isn't measured in right or wrong, it's measured in growth, in margins, in performance compared to competitors. If refusing a deal means falling behind, the deal gets justified. If staying silent protects access, silence becomes policy. Executives don't wake up thinking about history books. They wake up thinking about targets. This isn't villainy in the cinematic sense. It's something colder, structural, predictable. When profit is rewarded and restraint is punished, behavior follows the reward. Numbers don't feel guilt, and this is where the illusion breaks. Because when wrongdoing is finally exposed, people expect accountability. Trials, punishment, a line that says, this behavior stops here. What usually follows instead is a calculation. Fines are issued, settlements are reached, apologies are written by legal teams, and the cost is quietly absorbed as an expense, not a deterrent. A rounding error compared to the profits that came before, and the market's still waiting ahead. No executives lose fortunes. No companies disappear. The machine keeps running, slightly adjusted, slightly rebranded, legally sanitized. If the penalty is smaller than the profit, the behavior isn't punished. It's priced in, and once it's priced in, it becomes policy. If it's affordable, it's allowed. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, because this story doesn't stay in the past. It doesn't live in archives or documentaries or black and white footage. It moves forward, carried by everyday choices that feel harmless on their own. Your money doesn't disappear when you spend it. It votes. It flows. It supports systems you'll never see and decisions you'll never be told about. Not because you agree with them, but because convenience makes distance feel like innocence. No one asks you to fund atrocities directly. They don't have to. They rely on complexity, opacity, and the assumption that responsibility belongs to someone else. And as long as people keep believing that, nothing changes. You're already part of the system. Here's the final truth most people never hear. This doesn't end. Not with a war, not with a trial, not with a documentary. As long as incentives remain intact, the behavior continues, quietly, efficiently, behind better language and cleaner branding. The tools get more advanced. The systems get more complex. The justifications get more polished. But the math stays the same. Profit is rewarded. Restraint is not. History doesn't warn you when it's repeating. It waits until the damage is done, then lets people argue about responsibility afterward. What happened once can happen again, and it will not because people are evil, but because the system doesn't require them to be. The next chapter is already being written. If this story unsettles you, that's the point. Because history isn't clean, and it isn't finished. The versions we're taught are simplified so we don't ask harder questions about money, power, and responsibility, about who benefits when the world breaks. So stay skeptical. Question stories that feel too neat. Follow the incentives, not the speeches. Follow the money, not the flags. And remember, what gets hidden usually matters most. If you want more of the history they don't like to talk about, stay here. There's more coming. History isn't over. It just learned to hide.